good evening. Welcome to Walking Through the Bible. I will not be before you long. We only have Leviticus 14 and 15 today, okay? And again, we are still in just going over the different, I would say, processes that took place during that time in regards to offering purification. We did talk yesterday about this slightly, but it was more so testing what exactly if somebody was clean or unclean concerning skin disease, usually leprosy. Okay, so we talked about that yesterday, and we ended with talking about that and mold and just what had to be done if either of those were found clean or unclean. Okay, so today we're getting into Leviticus 14 to 15, and this dealt more so. We talked about just the testing to see if they were clean or unclean. Today we're talking about the law of cleansing a leper. So basically, what the process was for cleansing for those that had skin diseases. Okay, so one of the things that we do see when we start reading, we see I think something that really stood out was just okay, the priest goes out of the camp to examine them, but we see what comes up is the priest orders two live clean birds, some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop that would be brought. And he goes over the process of just the birds being killed under fresh water. We see the cedar wood, the scarlet. So I'm just kind of, because they went into detail regarding what they did with this, I'm just going to kind of give a little bit of an overview concerning what each thing represented, okay, and why they use the two clean birds, like we see the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop, okay. So the two birds is said to represent life through death, okay. So one bird is killed over fresh, which is living water. The other bird is released into the open field. So this is kind of what we see as we're reading. Okay, and usually this means the slain bird would represent death and the released bird would represent life, freedom, and restoration. So together it looks like death, cleansing, and a restored life. Okay, and we see this process and this pattern shows up repeatedly in scripture, right? Next, we have the cedar wood, which represented strength and endurance. Okay, cedar was resistant to rot and insects. Okay, and it was also associated with longevity and majesty. Okay, symbolically, it represented life, strength, and incorruptibility. Okay, so it pretty much contrasted with disease and decay. Okay, then we have my alarm, sorry. Then we have scarlet yarn, and the scarlet yarn represents blood and life. Okay, so scarlet is the color of blood, we know. It represents vitality and sacrifice normally. So it visually ties the whole process to life poured out. Okay. So scarlet again appears multiple times in other purification processes, just reinforcing the blood life connection. Okay. Hyssop, which we see a lot as well, was said to represent humility and cleansing. Okay. Hyssop was a small, low growing plant. And it was used pretty much like a tool, so like a brush or a sprinkler. Hyssop symbolized humility, purification, and obedience in just the cleansing process. Okay, it was used also to apply blood or water. Okay, so using these items together pretty much enacted the removal of death, restoration of life, and cleansing and reintegration. Okay, so that's pretty much what all of them together reenacted. So in Leviticus 14, it gives us a layout, if you would, about restoring someone from symbolic death back into the community of the living. Okay, so we know that it was an 8-day process, and we saw in the scripture. In that scripture, it talked about, of course, it was washing, cleansing, shaving, and then bringing sacrifice, which was guilt, sin, burnt, and grain. Okay. It also showed us the oil and the sprinkling. We know it says 7 times, multiple times, and we know 7 usually represented completion, or that a thing was finished or completed. So keep that in mind. Even when we're reading, we see that a lot of times, and that's what that represented in that particular verse. Good evening. Good evening. So I didn't have the chat up at first, so I apologize. In verses 54 to 57, we see it's ending. And again, just like yesterday, we talked about mold, and it kind of went back into talking about mold and talking about going into house, cleansing it, purifying it, if there be mold in a house. Okay, so pretty much to sum up this chapter, we'll go to verses 56 to 57, which says these are the regulations for any defiling skin disease, for a sore, for defiling molds in fabric or in a house, and for a swelling, a rash, or a shiny spot, to determine when something is clean or unclean. These are the regulations for defiling skin diseases and defiling mold. So that pretty much sums up that chapter. We went through which each represented was something that stood out to me. And we went through the process. They gave us the process as far as what happens in regards to the cleansing of the leper. Okay, so it does give, it's very detailed. Again, we have a lot of details, but that's pretty much what it was compiled of. Okay, so now we're going to go over to chapter 15. Okay. And chapter 15, this deals with, a lot of us have heard about this before, but it deals with the discharges, bodily discharges or secretions. Okay. I'm not going to go into that too much, but it pretty much talks about when certain discharges, if any man has discharges out of their body, including the things that they said. I'm going to keep this PG. I mean, it's in the Bible, but still, I just feel a little uncomfortable saying that. But I'm sure all of us that read, we know what it says. Okay, the S word. Okay, which is a bodily secretion. It goes into talking about that and what happens if, for what they lay on, whatever they touch is deemed unclean until evening. What they lay on, anybody that they're with, all of these things were deemed unclean if a person were to have a discharge, if a man was. And then it goes, of course, into the female when there was a discharge or that time of the month, what they would deem clean and unclean, versus it also talks about sexual relations, and when the S word comes out in sexual relations, that both of them are considered unclean, and the same with the monthly situation with women. Both were considered unclean if there was any type of contact. So whether it was a bed that they laid on, whether it was a chair that they sat in, whether it also said spit, like if they spit on any of these things, were considered unclean until evening, as we see in the text. So it pretty much gave us, that was pretty much the entire chapter, just telling us about, of course, what they laid on, what they sat on, anything that they touched pretty much was unclean when there was discharge anywhere. So it goes through the same type. We see the same type of process here. We have 7 days that they had to wait. For the females, of course, it was 7 days after the flow pretty much stopped. And if it continued, then they would have to stay until 7 days after it actually stopped. And on the 8th day, they would bring again a sacrifice, sin and burnt offering, to make atonement for the person. So we see that whole process again and again. 7 usually represents the completion of it. And day 8 usually represents a new beginning. So even in Leviticus 14, when we were talking, even with the cleansing and the washing and the shaving, by them waiting in their preparation period, that 7 days, the 8th day pretty much was like a restoration and a freedom and a new beginning. Okay, so in this, it is the same way in dealing with those particular things. Okay. So that pretty much sums up this chapter as well. As I said, not long tonight because these were kind of quick chapters. But again, verses 32 to 33, these are the regulations for a man with a discharge, for anyone made unclean by an emission of semen, for a woman in her monthly period, for a man or a woman with a discharge, and for a man who has sexual relationships with a woman who is ceremonially unclean. Okay, so this was all of the regulations, this was the processes, these were the things that they had in place to just make sure everything was done basically in decency and in order, and things that were clean were not made unclean, or things that were unclean, the process that it had to go through to become clean. Okay, so that was pretty much that. We went through chapters 14 and 15 on this evening. Again, thank you guys for joining us on this evening. I told you I was going to be quick. 12 minutes. I hope everyone has a wonderful night. If you have not had a chance to read the chapters, it's good to get context and to understand kind of what is going on even in this book, because I know a lot of times people rush over this book. I've done it before because I was like, what is all that? You can't eat pig, like just everything that it deals with. But it's good to actually go into it and just learn and research and kind of get an understanding of different things that may have been done. It would probably be good if some of these things were still in place now. But everyone have a wonderful night. Thank you guys for joining us. Continue to join us throughout the week. Of course, we aren't on Sundays, but we are on Monday through Saturday. We also have a conversation on the, I believe it's the fourth Saturday of the month, in regards to what we've been talking about during the month. So definitely feel free to join us. If you need additional information, definitely check out our Facebook page. Everything should be on there. If you don't see it, feel free to message us via Messenger for those that are on Facebook. If you're on YouTube, you can always email us, info@kochurch.com. Okay. Thank you guys for joining us. Love you guys and have a wonderful, wonderful night. Okay. Bye-bye.